Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight, we're going to talk about one of the most absurdly inhospitable places humans have ever decided to live. I'm talking about Yakutia, or as it's officially known now, the Sakha Republic, nestled in northeastern Siberia like a frozen time capsule that nobody asked for, but somehow keeps getting more interesting the longer you look at it. Before we dive in, I want you to do something for me. Dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket. Get comfortable, because we're about to spend the next few hours in a place so cold that your breath freezes into ice crystals and falls to the ground like tiny, whispering snow. We're talking about temperatures that hit minus 71 degrees Celsius. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. That's just Tuesday in Yakutia sometimes. Now, here's the thing about Yakutia that gets me every single time I think about it. For thousands of years, people have lived there. Not just survived there, but actually lived there. Built civilizations, created art, fell in love, had arguments about who ate the last of the dried fish, and generally went about the business of being human in a place where being human seems like a terrible idea. So tonight, we're going to figure out how that happened. We're going to wander through centuries of adaptation, cultural brilliance, Soviet brutality, and modern absurdity, all set against the backdrop of frozen tundra that makes Antarctica look like a beach resort. The Sakha Republic today covers about 3 million square kilometers. To give you some perspective, that's roughly the size of India, except instead of being a place where you can grow rice and have a reasonable chance of surviving without modern heating, it's basically a giant freezer with some really determined people inside it. Yakutsk, the capital, sits at about 62 degrees north latitude. The average winter temperature hovers somewhere around minus 40 Celsius. The record low is minus 64.4 Celsius. That was recorded in 1933. But honestly, the point is that it gets so cold that the distinction between very cold and apocalyptically cold becomes a bit academic. And yet, here we are. Humans moved to this place, figured out how to make it work, and despite everything that happened to them over the centuries, they're still there, still making art, still telling stories, still, occasionally, being completely baffled by outsiders showing up and asking them how they do it. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Let's go back to a time when Yakutia was already ancient, already established, and already home to people who had figured out something that most of us never will. How to be genuinely at home somewhere that everyone else thinks is a nightmare. The Sakha arrive. Migration and settlement. The history of human settlement in Yakutia doesn't start with the Sakha. But honestly, it might as well have. Before they showed up, there were people there, sure. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been poking around in northeastern Siberia for at least 14,000 years, which is impressive in a why would you do that kind of way. But the real story, the one that shaped everything that came after, starts around the 13th or 14th century, when a people called the Sakha migrated northward from somewhere around the Baikal region. The migration theory goes a little something like this. The Sakha were originally a Turkic people which, is interesting because Turkic peoples are generally associated with the warmer parts of Asia. The steppes, the not frozen wasteland parts. But for reasons that historians still debate, around the 1300s or so, a group of them started moving north and east. Maybe they were pushed by other tribes. Maybe they were following reindeer herds. Maybe there was some economic opportunity that seemed brilliant at the time and only became obviously terrible once they got there. The records are not super clear on this point, which is fair, because writing things down is hard enough without doing it while your fingers are numb. What we do know is that by the time Russian explorers and Cossacks started showing up in the 1600s, the Sakha had already established themselves pretty firmly in the Yakutia region. They had figured out how to live there. They had built a culture that actually made sense for the environment. They had domesticated horses and reindeer. They had developed a language, traditions, and a pretty specific set of answers to the question, how do you not freeze to death? The Sakha people were, in a lot of ways, perfectly adapted to the Siberian landscape. They had come from warmer climates, sure, but they brought with them a level of flexibility and problem solving that turned out to be exactly what you need when you move to a place where the ground stays frozen year-round. This phenomenon, where the ground doesn't thaw even in summer, is called permafrost, and it's basically the defining geographical feature of Yakutia. It's like living on a planet, except the planet is Earth, and it's very cold. The Sakha had reindeer herds. This was crucial. Reindeer are basically the perfect animal for Siberia. Assuming you accept the premise that living in Siberia is something you would want to do. They can survive on vegetation that grows in frozen places. They can travel across snow. They provide meat, hides, bone for tools, and a general sense of purpose in a landscape that doesn't offer much obvious utility. The Sakha herders would travel with their herds across the tundra, following the animals as they moved with the seasons, living in temporary structures that they could break down and move along with the herd. But the Sakha weren't just herders, and this is important. They also settled in more permanent communities. They figured out how to keep horses in this environment, which honestly seems like it shouldn't be possible. Horses are not naturally cold weather animals, but Yakutian horses are a thing, and they're real, and they're somehow smaller and stockier and more determined than horses that live in normal places. The Sakha would breed these horses specifically for the climate, and horses became central to Sakha culture in a way that's hard to overstate. A man's wealth was measured in horses. A man's status was tied to his horses. Romance was conducted via horses. Everything circled back to horses. They also figured out how to farm, which again seems insane when the ground is frozen half the year. But they developed techniques for it. They grew root vegetables. They adapted crops to short growing seasons. They became genuinely skilled at extracting what little the land would give them. And they hunted fish, moose, reindeer, birds. The Sakha became expert hunters and fishermen, reading the landscape in ways that outsiders couldn't begin to understand. By the the 1600s, when Russians started arriving, the Sakha had been living in Yakutia for a few hundred years. They had a functioning society. They had accumulated knowledge. They had stories and songs and traditions that reflected thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to exist in cold places. They had shamanic practices and spiritual beliefs that were deeply connected to the landscape and the animals they lived alongside. They had a language that expressed concepts and relationships that didn't really exist in Russian or European languages. They had, in short, figured out something that most people would say is impossible: how to build a genuine civilization in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And then, of course, the Russians showed up and started messing with everything. Russian contact and early colonization, so let's set the scene. It's the 1600s. Russia is expanding eastward, partly out of economic interest, partly out of that general imperial impulse that was going around Europe at the time like a particularly aggressive cold, and partly because, honestly, there was all this land just sitting there, and nobody in Moscow was using it, so why not claim it? The Russians who showed up in Siberia were mostly Cossacks. If you're not super familiar with Cossacks, here's the summary. They were frontier warriors and adventurers who were good at riding horses and being generally tough about things. They were soldiers, but also kind of independent operators. The Russian government would send them out to claim territory, build forts, and establish trade routes, and the Cossacks would do it with varying degrees of official oversight. Now, when these Cossacks encountered the Sakha, there was an immediate and somewhat obvious conflict. The Cossacks wanted furs. Siberia had furs. Lots of furs. Sable, fox, mink, all the fancy furs that European nobility would pay good money for. The fur trade was, in many ways, the economic engine of early Russian expansion into Siberia. And the Sakha, unfortunately for them, knew exactly where to find these furs. The relationship between Russian colonizers and Sakha people was, as you might expect from any colonial relationship, pretty complicated. It wasn't exactly slavery, at least not initially, but it was definitely exploitation. The Russians would demand tribute from Sakha groups. They called it yasak, and it was basically a tax, except it was paid in furs, and it came with the implied threat of violence if you didn't comply. The Sakha people had to give up a significant portion of their fur production to Russian authorities, which meant that they had less to trade for things they actually needed. It was colonialism in its most straightforward form. We show up, we decide you owe us things, and we take them. The Russians also built forts. Yakutsk was founded in 1632, right on the Lena River. It started as a small wooden fortress, basically a place where Russian soldiers could hang out and collect furs, and make sure the local population understood who was in charge. But it gradually grew into the largest settlement in the region. More Russians came. They brought their own food, their own animals, their own diseases. They established markets. They started farming, though farming in Yakutia was even more of a nightmare than it was for the Sakha, who had at least had centuries to figure it out. There was violence, of course. There were Sakha resistance movements. There were Cossack raids. There were periods of relative peace where trade was conducted, and both sides just tried to get through the winter without everyone dying. But the general trajectory was pretty clear. Russian authority expanded. Sakha independence contracted. By the end of the 1600s, most Sakha people had come under some form of Russian control, though control is a generous word for a system where you're spread out over millions of square kilometers and can really only enforce your authority in the immediate vicinity of the forts you've built. The Russians, for their part, were not great at the Siberian lifestyle. They kept trying to do things the Russian way, which is fine if you're in Russia, but less fine when you're in minus 40-degree temperatures. They struggled with agriculture. They struggled with hunting. They struggled with understanding the landscape. They got scurvy from a lack of fresh vegetables. They got frostbite. Winters killed a lot of them, but they kept showing up because the fur trade was profitable and the Russian government wanted to expand eastward. The Sakha, meanwhile, had to adapt to a new reality. They were now living in a colonial system. They had Russian authorities above them. They had to pay tribute. They couldn't just disappear into the tundra anymore because the Russians would find them, or at least they'd find their families. But here's the thing about the Sakha. They were resilient. They negotiated with Russian authorities. They found ways to work within the system. Some of them became translators or intermediaries. Some of them got into the fur trade themselves, working as intermediaries between Russian traders and more remote Sakha groups. They adapted, which is kind of their whole thing. By the 1700s, a peculiar kind of equilibrium had developed. The Russians controlled the towns and the official authority structure. The Sakha controlled the landscape itself, the knowledge of how to live in it, and the actual production of furs. There was tension, sure, and periodic violence, but there was also trade and a kind of cultural mixing that was inevitable when two groups have to figure out how to share the same space for centuries. And then things got weird in a different way. The Age of Enlightenment comes to the frozen frontier. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when we discuss Russian colonialism in Siberia. As the 18th century rolled along, European Enlightenment thinking started making its way into Russia, and with it came a curious attitude toward exploration and science. Russian explorers and naturalists started showing up in Siberia, not just to collect furs or enforce authority, but to collect information, to write things down, to study the people, the animals, the landscape, the climate. This created a weird situation where you had Russian intellectuals becoming genuinely interested in Sakha culture, writing detailed descriptions of Sakha traditions, documenting their language, studying their shamanic practices with something approaching genuine anthropological rigor. It wasn't done out of pure altruism, mind you. It was still fundamentally colonial. The Russians were studying the Sakha the way you might study an interesting animal in a zoo, but at least they were writing it down, which means we have records now of what Sakha life looked like in the 1700s. What emerges from these accounts is a picture of a people who were genuinely skilled at living in an extreme environment. The accounts describe Sakha horse culture in detail. They describe hunting techniques and fishing methods. They describe the construction of traditional dwellings, which were adapted specifically for Siberian winters. They describe Sakha clothing, which was ingeniously designed to trap heat while allowing for movement. They describe Sakha music and storytelling traditions. One thing that comes up repeatedly in these accounts is something called the Yakut horse. And honestly, this horse deserves its own historical chapter because it's genuinely remarkable. The Yakutian horse is a small, stocky breed that can survive in temperatures where regular horses would just give up and freeze. They can find food under snow that would look like an impassable barrier to other horses. They can survive winters by eating bark from trees and lichen. They have thick coats and stocky builds. And for the Sakha, they weren't just transportation. They were status. They were wealth. They were central to every aspect of life. A rich Sakha man was a man with a large herd of horses. A powerful Sakha leader was someone who could command the loyalty of other men and their horses. Horses showed up in Sakha mythology and folklore. There were horse races and horse competitions. Horses were gifted as bride prices. A man's character was partly judged by how he treated his horses. If all of this sounds a lot like how various nomadic and pastoral peoples have historically related to horses across Central Asia, that's because it is. The Sakha had come from cultures where horses mattered, and they had adapted that cultural priority to their new environment. But here's where it gets interesting. The Sakha didn't just keep the horse culture from wherever they came from. They adapted it. They developed specific Yakutian horse breeds. They developed specific techniques for horse management in permafrost regions. They figured out what kinds of grasses and vegetation horses could eat in Siberia. They essentially took a cultural practice and modified it to fit a completely new geographical reality. That's actually kind of the story of the Sakha people in general. Take something from your past and adapt it to work in a landscape that would seem to make it impossible. During this period, the Sakha were also becoming more integrated into the Russian colonial system, which had both positive and negative effects depending on how you look at it. More Sakha people learned Russian. Some of them became traders and merchants. Some of them became more wealthy through trade. A small Sakha elite developed relationships with Russian authorities. And at the same time, many Sakha people were being pushed further into the margins, herding reindeer in the most remote areas, far from the centers of Russian settlement and trade. The shamanic traditions of the Sakha people were also evolving during this period. Russian Orthodox Christianity was making its way north and east, and while it never completely replaced traditional Sakha beliefs, it definitely influenced them. You get this fascinating religious syncretism, where Sakha people practiced a kind of Christianity mixed with traditional shamanic beliefs. The shamans still held power, still performed rituals, but now there was also an Orthodox priest in town, and some people went to church, and somehow both systems coexisted. This is also the period when the Russian government started getting seriously interested in using Siberia for things other than fur extraction. They started thinking about it as a place to send political prisoners. They started thinking about it as a frontier where Russian civilization could expand. And they started thinking about it as a resource that Russia could develop and exploit for the benefit of Russia. None of this was good news for the Sakha, but at least during the 18th century, there was a kind of stability. People settled into routines. Sakha communities learned how to navigate Russian authority. Russians learned, slowly and painfully, how to survive in the Siberian climate. Trade networks developed. Cities grew. And through it all, the Sakha people maintained their language, their culture, their traditions, even as they adapted to living in a colonial system. Political exiles and the 19th century. So here's a plot twist that nobody saw coming. In the late 1700s, and especially the 1800s, the Russian Empire started using Siberia as a dumping ground for political prisoners and exiles. This included everyone from radical intellectuals to members of secret societies to just generally rebellious people that the Russian government wanted to get far away from the capital. Now, from a historical standpoint, this created a fascinating situation. You had educated, politically engaged, often quite brilliant Russians being sent to remote Siberian towns where they would spend years or decades in exile. Some of them were pretty rough customers. Some of them were idealists. Some of them were both. And they were landing in places like Yakutsk, which, while not the most remote settlement in Siberia, was still pretty thoroughly removed from the centers of Russian civilization. The most famous of these were probably the Decembrists, a group of Russian nobles and officers who participated in an armed rebellion against the Tsar in 1825. The rebellion failed, obviously, because rebellions against the Tsar were not usually successful things, and many of the Decembrists got sent to Siberia. Some of them ended up in Yakutia. These were educated men, often from noble families, and they were now living in frozen exile thousands of kilometers from Moscow. What's interesting about this period is the interaction between these exiles and the local Sakha and Russian communities. Some of the exiles wrote extensively about what they observed. They documented Sakha traditions. They described the harsh conditions. They reflected on their own situations. And in some cases, they became genuinely invested in the communities where they were exiled. They opened schools. They taught local children. They shared knowledge. They became, in a weird way, a channel through which enlightenment and modern thinking made its way into Siberia. But it wasn't all enlightened intellectuals sharing knowledge. Political exile in Siberia was genuinely brutal. The journey itself could kill you. Many exiles arrived sick, malnourished, and already traumatized. The winters were brutal. The isolation was complete. Many of them died before their sentences were even finished. There was often tension between the exiles and the local authorities, and between the exiles and the local population. Some of the exiles adapted and even found a kind of peace in Siberia. Others never got over the experience. Meanwhile, the 1800s also saw the Russian government getting more serious about developing Siberia as an economic region. There were proposals for railroads. There was more mining. There was more agricultural development. Yakutsk, still relatively small by Russian standards, was nonetheless slowly becoming more integrated into the broader Russian economic system. For the Sakha people, the 19th century was a period of increasing pressure. Russian settlement continued to expand. More Russians meant more competition for resources. The fur trade that had been so central to Sakha economy was starting to decline as fashions changed, and fur-bearing animals became harder to find. Some Sakha people adapted by becoming merchants or traders themselves. Some became farmers or herders on a larger scale. Some got pushed into poverty and marginalization. The Sakha language and culture, though, remained resilient. Despite being surrounded by Russians, speaking Russian in official and commercial contexts, attending Orthodox churches, the Sakha people maintained their language, their oral traditions, their folk customs. There was a Sakha intellectual movement developing in the late 1800s, with Sakha writers and thinkers starting to document and preserve their own culture. This is actually kind of remarkable because it was happening while they were living under Russian colonial rule. They were actively engaging with their own cultural heritage, even as external forces were pressuring them to assimilate into Russian culture. The 1800s also saw the development of Yakutsk into a more significant urban center. It had markets, government buildings, schools, churches. There was a bureaucracy. There was a merchant class. There were Russian cultural institutions, but it was still small by Russian standards. There were still mostly just wooden buildings. Supply lines from Moscow were long and unreliable. Winters still killed people, and it was still surrounded by Sakha people living in ways that were fundamentally different from how Russians lived. The Soviet Revolution and the Great Reckoning. And then, in 1917, Russia had a revolution, and suddenly everything changed. The Bolsheviks took over, and they had big ideas about how to reorganize society. And they had very big ideas about what to do with Siberia. The early Soviet period, from about 1917 to the mid-1930s, was kind of chaotic in Siberia. The civil war that followed the revolution reached even to remote areas like Yakutia. There were white army forces and red army forces fighting for control. There were questions about what would happen to indigenous peoples like the Sakha under the new communist system. There were initially some attempts to preserve Sakha culture and language because the Bolsheviks, at least in theory, were supposed to be against Russian imperialism and in favor of respecting the cultures of different peoples. But here's the thing about communist ideology when it meets reality. It sounds good on paper. Self-determination for indigenous peoples, respect for cultural diversity, protection of languages and traditions. But in practice, especially under Stalin, it got complicated very quickly. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Soviet government started implementing policies that that were absolutely catastrophic for Sakha people, and basically all the herding peoples of northern Siberia. The policy was called collectivization, and the idea was that individual herds would be combined into collective farms, or kolkhozes, where everything would be owned communally and organized by the state. In theory, this would lead to more efficient production. In practice, it was a disaster. For herding peoples like the Sakha, collectivization meant the end of their traditional way of life. You can't maintain a functioning pastoral culture when the state controls the herds and makes decisions about breeding, movement, and slaughter. You can't maintain your cultural practices when you're forced into a collective farm framework. You can't teach your children the traditional knowledge of herding when the state is telling you how to manage animals. The Sakha resisted. Some herders refused to join the collectives. Some killed their animals rather than hand them over to the state. The Soviet government responded, as it often did, with force. There were arrests. There were executions. There were deportations. The period of 1930 to 1933 in Yakutia was basically a small-scale version of the horrors that were happening in other parts of the Soviet Union. People were starving. Cultural traditions were being suppressed. Intellectuals and traditional leaders were being eliminated. The Sakha language, which had persisted for centuries under Russian colonial rule, was now under pressure to be replaced by Russian. Sakha schools that had existed in the late 1800s were being transformed into Soviet schools that taught in Russian. Sakha oral traditions and cultural practices were being discouraged. The state wanted everyone to be Soviet, which meant Russian-speaking, collective farm living, atheist in practice, if not always in belief. But again, here's where the Sakha people showed their resilience. They didn't disappear. The culture didn't get erased. The language didn't die. Yes, it was suppressed. Yes, there was enormous trauma and suffering. But the core of Sakha identity persisted even through some of the worst years of Soviet rule. Yakutsk, meanwhile, was being rapidly developed. The Soviets wanted to industrialize Siberia. They wanted to extract resources. They wanted to build cities that were unmistakably Soviet, with apartment blocks and factories, and a modern infrastructure. Yakutsk started to grow rapidly in the 1930s and 1940s. Factories were built. The airport was developed. Roads and rail connections were expanded. The city went from being a kind of frontier outpost to being an actual Soviet city, albeit one in the middle of nowhere. And then World War II happened, and suddenly Siberia became important not as a place to exploit for resources, but as a place to move industry to keep it safe from the Nazis. Factories were relocated to Yakutia. Workers were sent. The city grew even faster, and by the end of the war, Yakutsk was a genuine Soviet city with a Soviet infrastructure and a Soviet population. For the Sakha people, this period was complicated. Some of them were integrated into the Soviet system. Some of them benefited from industrialization. Many of them were traumatized by the collectivization period and the suppression of their culture. But the old way of life was increasingly untenable. You couldn't go back to purely pastoral herding when the state controlled the herds. You couldn't maintain traditional practices when you had Soviet authorities telling you what to do. The Sakha people had to adapt to being Soviet citizens, even as they tried to maintain their language and culture in the margins. The Soviet years and forced adaptation, okay. So let's talk about what the Soviet period actually looked like for people living in Yakutia, because it's kind of fascinating in a depressing way. The Soviet Union was obsessed with development. Everything had to be bigger, faster, more efficient. Siberia, with all its vast resources and sparse population, was seen as a frontier where Soviet power could be demonstrated through construction and resource extraction. They built roads. They built buildings. They sent people. Lots of people. Yakutsk in the 1950s and 1960s was a growing city, but it was a growing city in the middle of permafrost. This created some genuinely weird architectural problems. When you pour warm foundations into frozen ground, the ground melts and your buildings sink. So the Soviets had to develop new construction techniques. They built buildings on stilts. They developed insulated foundations. They imported knowledge from other extreme climate regions. And they just kept building, because that's what Soviets did. They built things. It's what they did when times were good. It's what they did when times were bad. They just built things. The living conditions for Soviet workers sent to Yakutia were by and large not great. You got sent there as a punishment or as an assignment, and you had to deal with the worst winters on the planet. There were stories of workers arriving from warmer parts of the Soviet Union and just completely breaking down psychologically because the winters were so intense and the summers so brief. There were high rates of alcoholism. There were psychological problems, but there was also a kind of rough camaraderie among people who were all suffering together in an extreme environment. And here's the thing that's weird, but kind of important. The Soviet system, for all its flaws, did actually provide some things that allowed people to survive in Yakutia. There was food distribution, even if it was often inadequate. There was housing, even if it was cramped and poorly heated. There was work, even if it was dangerous or boring. The Soviet state might not have been great at making people happy, but it was kind of effective at keeping people alive, especially if you accepted the premise that you were living in the Soviet Union and you just had to deal with it. For the Sakha people, the Soviet period meant increasing integration into the urban, Russian-speaking Soviet system. More Sakha people moved to cities. More Sakha children went to Soviet schools where they learned Russian as the primary language. More Sakha people worked in factories or on collective farms or in government positions. The traditional pastoral lifestyle became increasingly rare. By the 1960s, the Sakha people had become, at least on paper, integrated Soviet citizens. But integration is not the same thing as assimilation. Even as Sakha people spoke Russian and worked in Soviet institutions, they maintained their language and culture. Sakha was still spoken at home. Sakha folk traditions persisted. Sakha music and dance were performed, though they were now filtered through a Soviet lens. It was a kind of cultural survival that happened in the spaces between what the Soviet state required and what the Sakha people chose to preserve. Yakutsk itself became a genuinely cosmopolitan city by Soviet standards. You had Russians from all over the Soviet Union. You had people from other Soviet republics. You had a Ukrainian restaurant and a Caucasian restaurant and a Central Asian tea house. You had theaters that performed Soviet theater. You had concert halls. You had universities. All of this in the middle of Siberia, where the temperature regularly dropped to -40, and the darkness in winter was so complete that you'd be depressed just thinking about it. The fur trade, which had been the economic engine of Siberia for centuries, was basically gone by the Soviet period. Furs were still trapped, and there were still state-run fur processing factories, but it was nothing like the old independent trading system. It was all organized through state agencies. The Sakha people, who had historically been involved in the fur trade, found themselves either working for state agencies or having to find new sources of income. Did develop during the Soviet period was diamond mining. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union discovered that Yakutia had significant diamond deposits. Big diamonds, the kind of diamonds that could be used industrially or sold for hard currency. This was huge for the Soviet economy, and it meant that Yakutia went from being a cold, remote region that nobody really cared about to being a cold, remote region with valuable resources that everyone in Moscow definitely cared about. Diamond mining brought more development. More cities grew up around the mining operations. More people came to work in the mines. More infrastructure was built. Yakutia started becoming genuinely economically important to the Soviet Union, and more pressure was put on the landscape, on the environment, and on the people living there. The Soviet system was also obsessed with science and technology. They were gonna conquer nature, even nature as extreme as Yakutia. So they set up research stations. They conducted climate experiments. They built observatories. Yakutsk became a center for permafrost research, which is kind of fitting because you can't study permafrost very well if you're not living in a place where permafrost exists. Soviet scientists figured out new things about how frozen ground behaves. They developed new construction techniques. They made Yakutia into a laboratory for understanding how humans could live in extreme climates. And honestly, some of what they did was genuinely impressive. Soviet scientists and engineers developed technologies and techniques that allowed humans to survive and even thrive in Yakutia in ways that might not have been possible without that investment. The irony is that the same system that suppressed Sakha culture and pushed people around was also making it more practical to actually live there. The late Soviet period and cultural preservation. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet system in Siberia had developed a kind of stable dysfunction. There were Soviet cities with Soviet infrastructure and Soviet culture. There were indigenous peoples who had been integrated into the Soviet system to varying degrees. There was constant tension between development and tradition, between Russian and indigenous culture, between what the state wanted and what people actually wanted. This period also saw a kind of cultural revival movement among the Sakha. There was a renewed interest in Sakha language, Sakha history, Sakha folk traditions. This happened partly because people were nostalgic for things that were being lost, partly because Sakha intellectuals and artists were actively working to preserve their culture, and partly because the Soviet system, while repressive, did occasionally allow space for folk culture and tradition, as long as it wasn't explicitly political. The Soviet Union was weird about folk culture. On one hand, it suppressed indigenous traditions and pushed assimilation. On the other hand, it also documented folk cultures, created museums, supported folk ensembles, and generally treated traditional culture as something worth preserving, as long as it was presented in an appropriately Soviet way. So you could have a Sakha folk ensemble that performed traditional music and dance, but they would be performing under the auspices of Soviet cultural institutions. Yakutsk, by the 1980s, was a city of about 200,000 people. It had modern buildings, many of them built on those special permafrost adapted stilts we talked about. It had a metro system that consisted of exactly 0 lines because the ground was too frozen for a traditional underground system. It had theaters and museums and cultural institutions. It had industrial areas with factories and plants. And it still got absurdly cold in winter, like still -40, still dark for months, still the kind of cold where you didn't want to go outside if you could avoid it. The Sakha people who lived in Yakutsk by this period were often professionals: teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, government officials. They spoke Russian fluently, often better than they spoke Sakha. They lived in Soviet apartment buildings. They worked in Soviet institutions. But many of them also maintained some connection to their culture. They might speak Sakha at home. They might have relatives who lived more traditionally. They might attend cultural events. They maintained an identity that was both Soviet and Sakha. Outside of Yakutsk, in the smaller towns and in the rural areas, the Sakha people maintained more of their traditional practices. There were still reindeer herds, though they were now organized as state farms rather than traditional pastoral operations. There were still traditional hunting and fishing practices. There were still Sakha communities that maintained their language and traditions more thoroughly. The Soviet government, for all its flaws, did actually invest in Sakha education and language. There were Sakha language schools. There were Sakha language publications. There was a Sakha theater. There was academic research on the Sakha language. So in some ways, the Soviet system preserved Sakha culture, even as it suppressed it. The relationship between Russians and Sakha in Yakutia during the late Soviet period was complicated. There wasn't really violent conflict or overt discrimination, at least not in the way there was in other parts of the Soviet Union. There was just the gradual pressure of a larger, more powerful culture overwhelming a smaller one. Russians spoke Russian. Government was conducted in Russian. Commerce happened in Russian. Sakha people could maintain their language and culture, but they had to do it while basically operating in a Russian-speaking context. And then, of course, the Soviet Union itself started falling apart, and everything changed again. The collapse and the 1990s chaos, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it didn't just transform Moscow and St. Petersburg. It transformed everywhere, including remote places like Yakutia, and it transformed things in ways that were sometimes unexpected. First of all, the economic system that had been keeping Yakutia running pretty much instantly fell apart. The state system of resource distribution shut down. The factories and mines that had been operating under Soviet planning either closed or had to figure out how to operate in a market system. The subsidies that had been flowing into Siberia from Moscow dried up, and suddenly people were left figuring out how to survive without the system that had been keeping them alive, however imperfectly. This was brutal, like genuinely brutal. The 1990s in Russia are famous for being chaotic and economically devastating. In Yakutia, it was all of that, but with the additional challenge of doing all this chaos in a place where it's minus 40 degrees. And there's not a lot of alternative economy besides natural resources. But here's where things got interesting from a cultural and political perspective. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that the suppression of indigenous cultures could end. People could start openly discussing Sakha history, Sakha identity, Sakha language. The Sakha people could start demanding political autonomy, and they did. In 1992, Yakutia declared sovereignty as the Sakha Republic. Now, this was an independence, because Russia wasn't about to let one of its resource-rich regions just leave. But it was autonomy. The Sakha Republic got its own government. Sakha people got more control over their own affairs. The Sakha language, which had been suppressed under Soviet rule, could be taught openly in schools. Sakha culture could be promoted officially. But this autonomy happened in the context of complete economic chaos. The economy wasn't working. People didn't have steady income. The infrastructure that the Soviet system had built was falling apart. Stores were sometimes empty. Heating systems were breaking down. It was, in short, a disaster. Yakutsk in the 1990s was a city in crisis. The population was actually declining, which was wild because it had been growing for decades. People were leaving, trying to go somewhere less cold, somewhere with better economic opportunities. The crime rate was high. There was social chaos. The old Soviet system of stability, however repressive, was gone, and nothing had really replaced it. For the Sakha people, the 1990s represented both opportunity and devastation. On one hand, cultural revival was possible. On the other hand, the economic system that had allowed people to live in such a harsh climate was collapsing. Traditional pastoral practices couldn't just be revived overnight. The skills had been lost. The infrastructure was gone. You can't just decide to go back to herding reindeer when you haven't done it in a generation. There was also tension between different Sakha people. Some wanted to move toward independence from Russia. Some wanted to maintain close ties with Russia. Some wanted to preserve traditional culture. Some wanted to modernize. Some wanted to develop the economy. Some wanted to protect the environment. It's the kind of tension that you see in indigenous communities all over the world when they get a chance at autonomy. Yakutsk, in the late 1990s, was a place where Soviet-era buildings were crumbling, where the infrastructure was breaking down, where people were struggling to figure out what life was supposed to look like. But it was also a place where Sakha culture was being openly celebrated, where Sakha language was being taught, where Sakha people were taking control of their own political and cultural institutions for the first time in maybe a century. The diamond mines, which had been crucial to the Soviet economy, were still operating, though often barely. The diamonds that came out of Yakutia had historically gone to Soviet military and industrial use. Now there were questions about where they should go, who should profit from them, how the money should be used. This resource that had been so important to Soviet planning was now a kind of hot potato in a chaotic economic system. The 2000s and the return of order and repression. By the early 2000s, the chaos of the 1990s was settling down, at least superficially. Russia under Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 2000, was reasserting central control over regional governments and natural resources. The idea of Yakutian sovereignty was being gradually rolled back. Moscow wanted control of the resource extraction economy. The federal government reasserted authority over the diamond mines and other valuable resources. This had contradictory effects for Sakha people. On one hand, the economy stabilized. The Russian state reasserted the infrastructure and the stability that allowed people to actually survive in such a harsh climate. On the other hand, the brief period of cultural autonomy and political agency that the Sakha people had experienced in the 1990s was being curtailed. Central control from Moscow was being reasserted, but the Sakha Republic remained somewhat distinct. It had its own government, even if it was ultimately subordinate to Moscow. It had its own Sakha president and a local bureaucracy. There was still a Sakha language and Sakha cultural institutions. Sakha people still had some sense of identity that was separate from just being Russian citizens. Yakutsk in the 2000s was a city that had stabilized, but was still dealing with the legacy of Soviet-era infrastructure and 1990s decay. The population was still relatively small, maybe 250,000 people. It was still one of the coldest inhabited cities in the world. It was still isolated, though better connected than it had been. The airport was improved. There was internet, eventually. There were modern buildings going up alongside Soviet-era ones. Economically, Yakutia's future was tied to natural resources. The diamond mines continued to operate. There were also gold mines, tin mines, and other mineral extraction operations. Oil and gas were potentially valuable. The Sakha Republic sat on significant natural resources, which made it economically important to Russia, but also created environmental pressures and questions about who benefited from those resources. For the Sakha people during this period, there there was a kind of stabilization mixed with ongoing cultural suppression. The Sakha language was still taught in schools, but increasingly, Russian was the language of education and commerce. More and more Sakha people were moving to cities, working in modern jobs, living modern lives. The traditional pastoral lifestyle had basically disappeared. You could visit a folk museum and see what traditional Sakha life had looked like, but you couldn't actually live that way anymore. There was also a new element introduced during this period: environmentalism. As people became more aware of environmental issues, they started noticing that Siberia, with its fragile permafrost ecosystem, was being degraded by mining and resource extraction. There were concerns about pollution. There were concerns about the effects of mining on permafrost. There were international scientists showing up to study climate change and finding that permafrost in Siberia was thawing, which was a sign of global climate change. This created an interesting dynamic where some of the most serious environmental research was being conducted in Yakutia, documenting how climate change was affecting this extreme region. And the irony was that the same region that was experiencing the most dramatic climate effects was also being used for resource extraction that was contributing to climate change. But for most people living in Yakutia during this period, these big global issues were kind of abstract. What mattered was whether you had a job, whether you could afford to heat your apartment, whether you could get food, whether you had some hope for the future. And for many people in Yakutia, there wasn't a lot of hope. The young people were leaving for Moscow or other warmer, more economically dynamic cities. The population was aging. The infrastructure was old. It was hard to see why anyone would stay if they could leave. The modern era and life in -71 OK. So now we're getting into the contemporary period. And this is where things get really interesting, because we can actually talk to people who are living in Yakutia right now and ask them why on earth they're doing it. Yakutsk today is a city of about 340,000 people. It's the capital of the Sakha Republic. It's one of the oldest settlements in Siberia. It's the coldest inhabited regional capital in the world. The average winter temperature is -41 Celsius. The record low is -64.4 Celsius. The permafrost extends hundreds of meters down. The city is built on this frozen ground, and it's a constant engineering challenge to keep the city standing. The buildings in Yakutsk reflect this challenge. Many of them are still built on those adjustable stilts that were invented during the Soviet era to deal with permafrost. The theory is that as the ground thaws slightly in summer, the buildings can sink, but the stilts can be adjusted to keep the buildings level. In practice, this means that Yakutsk is constantly sinking. The buildings are slowly going down. It's happening so slowly that you might not notice it year to year, but over decades, it's significant. The cold in Yakutsk is not an abstract thing. It's a constant, practical consideration. When it's -40 or colder outside, your car won't start if you leave it out overnight. You have to plug it into a block heater that that keeps the engine warm. The water in your car's radiator will freeze. The gasoline gets thick. Metal becomes brittle. Your skin will get frostbite if you expose it for more than a few minutes. People have routines that account for this. You plan your routes carefully. You don't stay outside longer than necessary. You dress in layers. You have special winter clothing that's been designed specifically for extreme cold. The standard winter outfit in Yakutsk is basically a full-body insulation system. There are long underwear, thermal socks, heavy pants, a thick parka, a face mask, goggles, heavy gloves. You look like an astronaut, basically. But here's the thing. People do this. They go to work. They go to school. They go to the store. They live their lives. The cold is constant, but it becomes normal. Kids grow up in this cold and don't think it's particularly unusual. Adults who have lived there for decades barely notice it anymore. The Sakha people who live in Yakutsk today are a mix of people with deep roots in the region and people who moved there for work or other reasons. Many of them have maintained connections to Sakha culture and language, though increasingly, younger Sakha people speak Russian more fluently than Sakha. There's been a cultural revival movement with efforts to preserve Sakha language and traditions, but there's also the pull of modern Russian culture and global culture. There's a Sakha theater in Yakutsk that performs traditional Sakha music and dance. There are museums dedicated to Sakha history and culture. There are Sakha language schools and programs. There's a sense that Sakha culture is something worth preserving, even as the practical day-to-day culture becomes increasingly Russified and modernized. One thing that has developed in recent years is a kind of cultural tourism. People come to Yakutsk specifically to experience the cold, to see what the coldest inhabited place on Earth looks like. There are tour companies that specialize in this. They take people to experience extreme cold, to see traditional Sakha culture, to visit permafrost research sites. It's a weird situation where Yakutia is being turned into a tourist attraction based on its extreme climate and indigenous culture. Modern economy of Yakutia is still based heavily on natural resources. The diamond mines are still operating, though the global diamond market has changed. There are other mining operations. There's some oil and gas development, though this is controversial both because of environmental concerns and because of geopolitical issues. Tourism is a growing sector. Government and bureaucracy employ a lot of people. There are some service industries, but it's still not a particularly diverse economy. The younger generation in Yakutsk faces a real choice. You can stay and work in the resource extraction industry or in government, which are the main economic bases. Or you can leave for Moscow or other warmer cities where there are more job opportunities and warmer weather. Many people choose to leave. The population of Yakutia peaked in the 1980s and has been gradually declining since then as people migrate out. For those who stay, life in Yakutsk is a mix of the practical challenges of extreme cold and the ordinariness of life in any modern city. There are restaurants and bars and cultural events. There's internet and modern amenities. There's a sense of community among people who are all dealing with the same extreme environment. And here's something interesting about the social psychology of living in extreme places. People who live in Yakutsk often develop a kind of pride about it. There's a sense that living in the coldest place on Earth requires a certain kind of strength or toughness. There's dark humor about the cold. There are jokes about how nobody would voluntarily move to Yakutsk, so everyone who lives there is either from there, crazy, or running from something. The language that people use to describe Yakutsk is interesting. It's often described as harsh, brutal, extreme. But there's also a kind of affection for it. People talk about the beauty of the winter landscape. They talk about the tight-knit community that develops when everyone is struggling against extreme conditions. They talk about the way that people look out for each other in situations where the environment is genuinely dangerous. The quirky characters of modern Yakutia, one of the things that makes Yakutia interesting is that it attracts a certain type of person. The people who live there are sometimes natives who have no choice or family ties. But sometimes they're people who came for specific reasons. Workers in the mining industry, scientists studying permafrost, adventurers wanting to experience something extreme, political appointees sent by Moscow, criminals hiding from authorities, people running from something, people looking for something. And then there are the people who have become famous for choosing to live in Yakutia despite having other options. There's a category of people that you might call extreme cold enthusiasts, people who are genuinely interested in how humans can survive in extreme conditions, who want to understand their own limits, who find the challenge appealing. There's also been a kind of artistic community that has developed around Yakutia. Artists, musicians, writers, photographers who are drawn to the extreme conditions and the unique landscape. The light patterns in winter are different from anywhere else. The way that snow and ice behave at these temperatures is different. The cultural landscape is different. So you get artists who come to Yakutia specifically because it's different and extreme. There's also the category of people who are just trapped there. They came for a job, or they followed someone else, or they thought they'd leave, but never got around to it. And now they're in their 50s or 60s, and they've spent the last 30 years in Yakutsk, and honestly, they don't know how to live anywhere else. The cold has become normal. The isolation has become normal. They have friends here. They have a job. They understand how things work. It would be scarier to leave than to stay. One interesting aspect of modern Yakutsk is how it's dealing with climate change. Permafrost is thawing. The buildings that are built on permafrost are becoming unstable. Scientists are warning that in coming decades, large parts of Yakutia might become less frozen, which would solve some problems but create others. The mining industry is interested in this because thawing permafrost could unlock new resources, but also makes extraction more difficult. The indigenous peoples are interested because changes to the permafrost affect traditional practices and the landscape itself. There's also been a kind of scientific tourism to Yakutia, where climate researchers come to study the effects of climate change in real time. Yakutia is becoming a kind of laboratory for understanding what happens to an extreme climate when global temperatures increase. And it's producing some alarming results. The permafrost is thawing faster than predicted. Ancient viruses are being released from melting ice. The landscape is literally changing year to year in visible ways. For the people who live there, climate change is not an abstract issue. It's something you can see happening. Roads are becoming unstable because the ground beneath them is thawing. Buildings are becoming more unstable. The permafrost that has been frozen for thousands of years is becoming less frozen. It's a weird kind of environmental catastrophe that's happening in slow motion. Let me tell you about some of the actual quirky characters who have made Yakutsk their home or have become famous for their connection to the region. There's the category of extreme cold athletes, people who are interested in testing the limits of human endurance in cold. There are ice swimmers who swim in water that's barely above freezing. There are runners who run marathons in minus 40-degree weather. There are people who set world records for how long they can stand outside in extreme cold without protective gear. These people are genuinely fascinated by the question of how far human physiology can be pushed. They study the effects of extreme cold on the human body. They develop new techniques for protection against cold. They push themselves to the limit, and then they push further. There's also been a kind of festival culture that has developed in Yakutsk. The Sakha people have traditional winter festivals that have been celebrated for centuries. But in modern times, these have been revived and turned into more official cultural events. The most famous is probably the Ihiak festival, which celebrates Sakha culture with music, dance, traditional sports, and cultural activities. It's become a big annual event that attracts visitors from around the world. Then there are the scientists. Yakutsk has several research institutions dedicated to studying permafrost and extreme cold environments. There are Russian scientists who have spent their careers studying how permafrost works. There are international scientists who come to collaborate. There are graduate students doing research on climate change. The city has become kind of a mecca for cold climate science. And then there are the regular people, the teachers who teach in schools, the doctors who work in hospitals, the construction workers who build things in an environment where traditional construction techniques often don't work, the miners who work in the mines, the shop owners and service workers, the elderly people who have lived their whole lives in Yakutsk and can't imagine living anywhere else, the young people who are trying to decide whether to stay or leave. There's a woman named Irina who works as a tour guide in Yakutsk. She was born there and has lived there her whole life. She speaks Russian, Sakha, and English. She knows the city intimately and can tell tourists exactly how to dress and behave to avoid frostbite while still being able to enjoy the extreme environment. She's genuinely enthusiastic about Yakutsk, which is kind of remarkable because Yakutsk is objectively brutal. But she finds it beautiful and interesting, and she genuinely enjoys helping people understand what it's like to live there. There's a man named Dmitry who works in the diamond mines. He came to Yakutsk from Moscow 30 years ago for a job and meant to stay for 5 years. But he made good money, got comfortable, got married, had kids, and somehow 30 years passed. And now his kids are grown up and he's in his 60s, and he can't leave because he's got roots there. He works hard, makes decent money by Russian standards, and spends his winters mostly indoors, trying not to think about how cold it is outside. There are the shopkeepers on the main streets of Yakutsk who have figured out how to run businesses in a place where people only want to be outside for the absolute minimum amount of time. They've optimized their shops to be places where people can get in, get what they need, and get out. They know their regular customers. They understand the seasonal rhythms of life in extreme cold. There are the construction workers who are constantly dealing with the challenge of building things on permafrost. They have to use specialized techniques. They have to deal with the fact that traditional building materials become brittle in extreme cold. They have to figure out how to work when it's so cold that your fingers go numb within minutes of exposure. But they do it. There are apartment buildings going up. There are renovations happening. The city is constantly being modified and adapted to deal with the challenges of its environment. Daily life in -40. Let's actually talk about what daily life looks like in Yakutsk, because it's kind of remarkable how people have managed to create something that looks almost normal in what should be uninhabitable conditions. First of all, winter in Yakutsk is long, really long. We're talking about October through April, so 6 months of serious cold. The darkness is intense. In December and January, the sun barely rises. You get a couple of hours of gray twilight around noon, and then it's dark again. This creates significant psychological pressure. People struggle with depression. There's a kind of seasonal darkness that affects everyone, but people have adapted. There's winter tourism. There are museums and cultural events. There are indoor swimming pools and sports facilities. There are restaurants and bars where people can gather. The city has figured out how to create reasons to stay indoors and reasons to go out despite the cold. Getting around the city in winter is a whole thing. You don't just walk anywhere. You plan your route carefully. You might take the bus or a taxi rather than walk if the distance is more than a few blocks. If you drive, your car has to be specially equipped for the cold. You need a block heater. You need good winter tires. You need to keep the car running when you park it, because if it cools down, it might not start again. Clothing is a whole science in Yakutsk. You can't just wear a regular winter coat like you would in, say, Canada or the northern United States. You need specialized cold weather clothing, heavy long underwear, thick insulation, wind-resistant layers, a hood that covers your face, goggles to protect your eyes, gloves that are thick but still allow you to manipulate objects, heavy boots with special insulation. The whole outfit can weigh quite a bit, and it makes you move slowly and carefully. If you're exposed to -40-degree weather without proper protection, you can get frostbite in minutes. Your face will start to sting. Your fingers and toes will start to get numb. If you keep going, the skin will start to freeze. If you don't get inside and warm up, you can have permanent tissue damage or even lose digits. So people take this seriously. There's a phenomenon in Yakutsk called diamond dust, where ice crystals form in the air because it's so cold and the air can't hold moisture. This creates a shimmering effect and makes everything look kind of magical in a creepy way. But it also makes breathing harder and creates visibility problems. Cars have their headlights on all day in winter because the visibility is just that poor. Heating is essential, obviously. Most buildings in Yakutsk are connected to a central heating system that provides hot water and heat to the whole building. This is a Soviet-era system that has been maintained over the decades. The heating is usually provided by burning fossil fuels. In winter, it's running full time. Some people say that the heating in Yakutsk is actually too efficient, that buildings get too hot, and people have to open windows in the middle of winter to cool things down. But you kind of need that reliability, because if the heating fails in a Yakutsk winter, you have maybe a few hours before pipes start freezing, and the situation becomes genuinely dangerous. Water freezes if you're not careful. Outdoor water pipes will freeze instantly. So systems have been developed to keep water moving and warm. Indoor plumbing is essential. If you live somewhere without indoor plumbing, you're in serious trouble. Food in Yakutsk is interesting. In the Soviet era, there was significant food production in Yakutia, though it was always supplemented with food from warmer regions. Now, most food is imported from other parts of Russia or from other countries. There are restaurants with various cuisines. There are markets with produce, though fresh produce in winter comes from greenhouses or is imported. There are traditional Sakha foods that are still eaten, particularly dishes made from reindeer and fish. There's a kind of food culture around fermented and preserved foods because you need foods that last through the winter. Dried fish is a staple, preserved vegetables, fermented dairy products. These are not just cultural traditions, but practical necessities in a place where fresh food isn't always available. Summer in Yakutsk is the opposite extreme. When the sun comes back and the days get long, it's light almost constantly. The temperature can get up to plus 30 Celsius, which feels hot after months of minus 40. The permafrost near the surface melts, creating a kind of muddy period where roads become difficult to navigate. But there's also this sense of relief and renewal. People spend as much time outside as possible. There are outdoor events and festivals. There's a sense of making the most of the brief period when the weather is tolerable. The psychological effect of these extremes is significant. There's the darkness and depression of winter. There's the euphoria and energy of summer. There's a kind of rhythm to life that's determined by the extreme environmental conditions. Social life in Yakutsk tends to revolve around indoor activities. There are bars and restaurants where people gather. There are cultural events. There are sports and recreation facilities. People visit each other's homes. There are parties and celebrations. Given that you can't just casually go outside, social life becomes more intentional and organized. There's also a kind of cultural attitude towards survival and resilience. Living in Yakutsk is seen as challenging, and people who live there see themselves as having a certain toughness or capability. There's pride in that. There's a sense that people who live in Yakutsk are a special kind of person. They're capable of dealing with extreme conditions. They're resilient. They're tough. This attitude extends to how people respond to problems. There's less complaining and more problem solving. If something doesn't work, you figure out how to make it work. If the system fails, you adapt. This is partly cultural and partly practical necessity. The Sakha language and cultural identity. Now let's talk about the Sakha language, because it's actually kind of crucial to understanding the Sakha people and how they've maintained their identity despite centuries of external pressure. The Sakha language is a Turkic language, which makes sense given that the Sakha people came from Central Asia originally. But it's a Turkic language that developed in isolation in Siberia, so it has developed in unique ways. It has influenced and been influenced by Russian and by the indigenous languages of the peoples around them. The Sakha language is actually quite beautiful if you listen to it. It has a kind of musical quality. There are sounds that don't exist in English or Russian. There are complex grammatical structures. There's a rich vocabulary that reflects centuries of adaptation to the Siberian environment. The Sakha language has traditional literature and poetry. There are epic poems and songs. There are stories that have been passed down through generations. There are proverbs and sayings that contain cultural wisdom. All of this is expressed in the Sakha language, and if the language disappears, so does this cultural heritage. The Soviet Union suppressed the Sakha language in favor of Russian. Children were educated in Russian. Government and commerce happened in Russian. Speaking Sakha became kind of a marker of being rural or backward. For several generations of Sakha people, Russian became their primary language, and Sakha became a secondary language that was used mainly at home with older family members. This created a real threat to the language. If younger generations don't learn the language from their parents, and the parents aren't teaching it because they're trying to assimilate or because they think Russian is more practical, the language starts to die out. You get to a point where there's no one left who speaks the language fluently, and suddenly you've lost something that has existed for centuries. After the Soviet Union collapsed and the Sakha Republic got a degree of autonomy, there was a real effort to preserve and revive the Sakha language. Schools started teaching Sakha as a primary language. There were programs to document the language. There were efforts to create new Sakha vocabulary for modern concepts. There were cultural programs to promote the use of Sakha. This created an interesting situation where older people who had learned Sakha as children were suddenly being looked to as authorities on the language, and younger people who had grown up speaking Russian were suddenly trying to learn Sakha because it was now seen as important to their cultural identity. The relationship between Sakha and Russian is one of the defining tensions in Sakha identity. You can't really live in modern Yakutia without speaking Russian. It's the language of government, commerce, education at higher levels, and most of modern life. But Sakha language is seen as central to cultural identity. So you get bilingual Sakha people who speak both languages fluently, code switching between them depending on context. They speak Russian at work, Sakha at home. They speak Russian with Russian friends, Sakha with Sakha friends. The languages exist in a kind of balance. There's also a third element, English. Younger Sakha people increasingly learn English because it's useful for the internet, for international communication, for business. So you get trilingual people who navigate between Russian, Sakha, and English, depending on context. The Sakha language is now protected by the Constitution of the Sakha Republic. It's an official language alongside Russian. It's taught in schools. There are media programs in Sakha. There are cultural institutions dedicated to preserving the language. But despite this, the language is still under pressure. The young people are increasingly primarily Russian speakers. The practical advantages of speaking Russian are significant. The future of the Sakha language is not guaranteed. There's also a question of Sakha cultural identity more broadly. What does it mean to be Sakha in the 21st century? For older people, it might mean speaking Sakha fluently, maintaining traditional practices, understanding Sakha history and traditions. For younger people, it might mean something different. It might mean being interested in Sakha culture and identity, but expressing it in modern, often Russian or English language contexts. There are Sakha musicians who blend traditional Sakha music with modern genres. There are Sakha artists who use traditional imagery and themes in contemporary art. There are Sakha writers who write in Sakha and in Russian. There are Sakha activists working to preserve Sakha culture and advance Sakha interests. The Sakha people have also developed a kind of diaspora. As younger people have moved to Moscow and other warmer cities, they've maintained connections to their Sakha identity, even while living in a Russian-dominant environment. There are Sakha cultural organizations in Moscow. There are Sakha people who visit Yakutia for the Ihyak festival or other cultural events. The natural world and adaptation. Now, let's talk about the actual environment that the Sakha people have been living in for centuries, because it's kind of remarkable how well they've adapted to it. Yakutia is defined by its climate. The average annual temperature is -5 degrees Celsius. The winters are extremely cold, as we've discussed extensively. The summers are brief and relatively warm. The spring and fall are basically non-existent, just quick transitions between winter and summer. The permafrost is the defining geological feature. This is ground that stays frozen year-round. In Yakutia, the permafrost extends hundreds of meters deep in some places. Active layer, the part that thaws in summer and refreezes in winter, is maybe a meter or two deep. Everything below that stays frozen. This creates some weird geological situations. There are fossils of extinct animals, like woolly mammoths, that are preserved in the permafrost and occasionally found when the permafrost thaws. There are layers of ice and frozen soil that have accumulated over thousands of years. It's like a time capsule made of ice. The vegetation in Yakutia is limited by the climate. The permafrost doesn't allow for deep-rooted plants. Trees are limited. The landscape is mostly tundra and taiga, with sparse vegetation. In summer, there are some wildflowers and some low vegetation, but it's not the lush landscape of more temperate regions. The animals that live in Yakutia are adapted to extreme cold. Reindeer are the big one, but there are also moose, which somehow survive despite being adapted for milder climates. There are small mammals like Arctic foxes and squirrels. There are birds, though many of them migrate south for the winter. There are fish in the rivers, particularly in the Lena River, which is one of the major rivers of Siberia. The Sakha people have traditionally hunted and fished these animals. They've maintained knowledge about where animals are at different times of year, how to hunt them effectively, how to process the meat and hides for maximum efficiency. Traditional Sakha hunting practices are still maintained to some degree, though they're now much less common than they were historically. You have older Sakha hunters who still go out in winter and hunt moose or reindeer using traditional techniques. You have fishermen who fish in the rivers in summer, but these are increasingly seen as cultural practices rather than primary sources of food. The Yakutian horse is worth going into more depth about, because it's such a perfect example of how humans and animals adapt to extreme environments. The Yakutian horse is a small horse, maybe 13 hands high, compared to the 15 or 16 hands of a regular saddle horse. It's stocky and muscular. It has a thick coat and a thick mane. It grows extra fur in winter that makes it look even stockier. Yakutian horses can survive on vegetation that would not sustain a regular horse. They can paw through snow to get at the grasses and lichens underneath. They can survive on bark and lichen in the deepest winter when there's no vegetation available. They have adapted over centuries to be perfectly suited to the Siberian climate. For the Sakha people, the Yakutian horse was not just transportation. It was wealth, status, and cultural identity. You measured your prosperity in horses. You measured your power in horses. You expressed your love and courtship through horses. The horse was central to Sakha culture. Modern Yakutia still has Yakutian horses, though now they're more of a cultural artifact than a practical transportation method. There are horse farms where they're bred. There are horse races and competitions. There are efforts to preserve the breed. But in everyday life in Yakutsk, you see cars and buses, not horses. The rivers of Yakutia are important. The Lena River is one of the major rivers of Siberia. It flows through Yakutia and eventually reaches the Arctic Ocean. The rivers are frozen in winter and open in summer. Traditionally, they were important for transportation and fishing. Now they're used for hydroelectric power and recreation. The landscape itself is harsh in a way that's hard to describe if you haven't experienced it. The color palette is limited. In winter, it's white and gray. In summer, it's green and brown. The horizon is often just a vast, flat expanse. There are no mountains to provide visual interest, just tundra stretching out to the horizon. This kind of landscape can be beautiful in its starkness, but it can also be profoundly depressing. There's a reason that people who move to Yakutsk often talk about the emotional impact of the environment. The aurora borealis is visible in Yakutia in the dark season. the northern lights put on a show in the winter sky. This is one of the beautiful aspects of living there. On clear winter nights, you get to see one of nature's most impressive light shows. Modern challenges and environmental concerns, okay. So let's talk about the serious problems facing Yakutia in the modern era, because they're substantial and kind of urgent. Climate change is the biggest one. Yakutia is warming faster than most places on Earth. The permafrost is thawing. This is creating a lot of problems. First of all, when permafrost thaws, it releases carbon that has been locked away for thousands of years. This carbon, in the form of methane and carbon dioxide, goes into the atmosphere and contributes to further warming. It's a feedback loop. The Earth warms, the permafrost thaws, which releases carbon, which warms the Earth more, which thaws more permafrost. For people living in Yakutia, this is visible and tangible. Roads are becoming unstable because the ground beneath them is thawing and becoming softer. Buildings that are built on permafrost are becoming unstable. There are sinkholes opening up where the ground has thawed. The landscape is literally changing year to year in visible ways. There's a phenomenon called thermokarst, where the permafrost thaws and the ground collapses, creating a kind of rolling, chaotic landscape. This is starting to happen in parts of Yakutia. There are also ancient pathogens being released as the permafrost thaws. In 2016, there was an outbreak of anthrax in Yakutia, linked to the thawing of frozen reindeer carcasses that had been buried in the permafrost. As the ground thaws, you get anthrax spores and other ancient pathogens being released into the environment. The environmental damage from resource extraction is also significant. The diamond mines, while economically important, have created environmental destruction. There's water pollution. There's air pollution. There's the general ecological impact of mining operations in a fragile ecosystem. There's also the question of indigenous rights and environmental protection. The Sakha people and other indigenous peoples have a stake in the future of Yakutia. Many of them are concerned about the environmental destruction caused by resource extraction. There's tension between economic development and environmental protection, between the need for jobs and income and the need to preserve the environment. There's also concern about climate refugees. As other parts of the world become uninhabitable due to climate change, Yakutia might become more habitable. There's speculation about whether climate change could eventually make Yakutia suitable for agriculture or other activities. This creates a kind of perverse situation where climate change is bad for Yakutia specifically, but might make it relatively more attractive compared to other places. The melting permafrost also releases mercury and other heavy metals that are locked in the ice. As this gets released into the water system, it affects fish and animals and the people who eat them. Traditional food sources are becoming contaminated. There's a kind of existential anxiety in Yakutia about the future. The environment that people have adapted to over centuries is changing rapidly. The economy is dependent on resource extraction, which is both necessary for survival and destructive to the environment. The young people are leaving. The birth rate is low. The future is uncertain. But there's also a kind of resilience. The Sakha people have adapted to extreme environments before. They've survived colonialism, Soviet rule, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all kinds of historical challenges. They're adapting to climate change too, even if it's difficult and sometimes feels hopeless. There are also efforts to develop sustainable industries. Tourism is growing. There are eco-tourism operations that take people to see permafrost and experience the extreme environment. There are cultural tourism operations. These create income without necessarily destroying the environment as much as resource extraction does. There are also research opportunities. Scientists from all over the world want to study Yakutia because it's a place where climate change is happening rapidly and visibly. This creates opportunities for local people to work as guides, in research support, etc. The question of why people stay after all of this, after all the talk about extreme cold and environmental destruction and economic challenges, the question that naturally arises is, why do people stay? Why does anyone voluntarily live in Yakutia? The answer is complicated. First of all, many people don't have a choice. They were born there. Their families are there. Their whole social network is there. It's home, and home is where you stay, even if it's inconvenient. For these people, Yakutia is not seen as some extreme challenge. It's just normal. Kids grow up in it. They learn how to dress for the cold. They learn the rhythms of extreme winter and brief summer. They develop relationships and friendships. They build lives. By the time they're old enough to make a choice, they've got such deep roots that leaving would be unthinkable. Second, there's economic dependency. The resource extraction industries, particularly diamonds, provide jobs and income. If you've got a job in mining or related industries, you're making decent money. You might not want to leave because you've got a good job, and jobs are hard to find in a lot of Russia. Third, there's the psychological factor. For some people, the challenge is part of the appeal. There's a kind of toughness that comes with living in extreme conditions. There's a sense of accomplishment. There's a community of people who are all dealing with the same thing, and there's a bond that comes from that. Fourth, there's the cultural and historical factor. For the Sakha people specifically, there's the knowledge that their ancestors have lived in this place for centuries. There's a cultural attachment to the land. There's a sense that this is their place, and they should maintain their presence there. There's also a practical consideration. If you leave Yakutia, where do you go? If you're from a small town in the interior of Yakutia, moving to Moscow or another major city is a massive adjustment. Moscow is expensive. The competition for jobs is fierce. You might end up in a worse situation than you were in Yakutia. For some people, there's also a kind of environmental attachment. Despite the hardship, there's a beauty to the landscape. There's the northern lights. There's the vast, empty spaces. There's something about being in such an extreme environment that appeals to certain people. And then there's just ordinary life. People fall in love. People have kids. People build careers. People make friends. All of the normal things that make life worth living happen in Yakutia, just like they happen anywhere else. And And once you've got those things built up, leaving is painful. I think the real answer is that humans are remarkably adaptable. We can adapt to almost any environment if we have enough time. The Sakha adapted to Yakutia centuries ago. Russians have adapted since the 1600s. Modern people are adapting right now. The brain adapts, the body adapts, the culture adapts, and eventually, what seems impossible becomes normal. There's a psychological phenomenon called the hedonic treadmill, where people adapt to new circumstances, and their baseline happiness remains relatively stable. You move to the coldest place on Earth, and yes, the first winter is brutal. But by the second or third winter, your brain has adapted. The cold is still there, but it's just part of your reality now. You develop coping mechanisms. You develop routines. You accept it. And in accepting it, you develop a kind of resilience. You're capable of dealing with hardship. You know you can survive extreme conditions. There's a kind of toughness that comes from that. It's not necessarily psychological strength, but rather the knowledge that you're capable of enduring and adapting. There's also the factor of social expectations. In Yakutia, staying is normal. Leaving is the exception. If you're from Yakutia and you're thinking about moving, you're doing something unusual. Your family might think you're abandoning your heritage. Your friends might think you're betraying your roots. There's a social pressure to stay. And honestly, for many people, that's enough. You stay because staying is expected, because it's what everyone around you does. And once you've committed to staying, you find ways to make it work. You find a job. You build a life. You have kids who grow up thinking Yakutia is normal. And then they stay too. The future of Yakutia. So what does the future hold for Yakutia? Where is this place heading? From an economic perspective, the future is uncertain. The diamond industry might continue or might decline depending on global markets. The oil and gas industry could develop further, though this is politically complicated given international sanctions and concerns about climate change. Tourism could grow, but it's unlikely to provide the same kind of income as resource extraction. The most likely scenario is that the economy will continue to be based on resource extraction, at least in the near term. This will continue to create environmental pressures and tensions between development and environmental protection. From a demographic perspective, the population is likely to continue to decline. Young people are leaving for Moscow and other warmer cities. The birth rate is low. Unless something changes, Yakutia will become less populated over the coming decades. This could actually be positive from an environmental perspective. Lower population means less resource extraction, less pollution, less demand on infrastructure. But it would be devastating from the perspective of the people who live there. Because fewer people means fewer jobs, fewer services, fewer reasons to invest in the region. From a cultural perspective, there's the ongoing question of Sakha language and culture. If the trend of Russification continues, Sakha might eventually become a minority language, even in Yakutia. Or there could be a cultural revival movement that successfully preserves and promotes Sakha culture. The Sakha Republic government has been promoting Sakha language and culture, at least in official rhetoric. Whether this will actually reverse the trend of Russification remains to be seen. There are Sakha cultural organizations and institutions working toward this. But the practical forces of globalization and Russification are strong. From a climate perspective, the future is dire. Climate change is accelerating. The permafrost is thawing faster than predicted. The infrastructure of Yakutia is built assuming frozen ground. If the ground thaws significantly, you're looking at a massive engineering and economic crisis. There's research being done on how to adapt to thawing permafrost, new building techniques, new infrastructure designs, but these are all expensive and would require massive investment. There's also the possibility of ecological collapse. If the permafrost thaws too much, the tundra ecosystem could change dramatically. This would affect the reindeer herds that some people still depend on. It would affect the fish populations in the rivers. It would change the whole character of the landscape. But here's the thing about humans. We're adaptable. Whatever the future holds, people will probably figure out how to live with it. They might not like it. They might struggle. But humans are good at adapting to new circumstances. There's also the possibility of technological solutions. If we developed efficient renewable energy, we could reduce the dependence on coal and fossil fuels for heating. If we developed new agricultural techniques, we might be able to grow more food locally. If we developed new resource extraction techniques that were less environmentally destructive, we could continue economic development while reducing damage. None of this is guaranteed, but there are possibilities. The most important question is probably whether the Sakha people and other indigenous peoples of Yakutia get to have a say in the future of their region. Historically, they've been colonized and exploited. Their land has been taken. Their resources have been extracted. Their culture has been suppressed. If the future is going to be better, it probably needs to involve giving indigenous peoples more control over their own future. This is a political question as much as an environmental or economic one. It involves power structures and who gets to make decisions about how the region develops. Specific stories from modern Yakutsk let me tell you about some specific people and their connections to Yakutia, because history is made up of these individual stories. There's a woman named Alina who was born in Yakutsk in 1962. Her father was a government official sent there from Moscow. She grew up in a Soviet apartment building in the city. She learned Russian from her parents and Sakha from her friends and teachers. She studied to be an engineer and worked in the diamond industry for her whole career. Alina is now in her 60s. She has grandchildren. She's lived in Yakutsk her whole life. She's seen the Soviet period, the chaos of the 1990s, and the stabilization of the 2000s. She's experienced the environmental changes. She's seen the city grow and change. Alina speaks Russian natively and Sakha fluently. She's bilingual, moving between the two languages depending on context. She's an intelligent person who understands the history of her region. She stayed in Yakutsk for 60 years because it's home. She couldn't imagine living anywhere else. There's a man named Alexei who is younger, maybe maybe 35 years old. He was born in a small town in the interior of Yakutia. His family were reindeer herders, but Alexei was smart in school, and when he was a teenager, he moved to Yakutsk to attend high school and then university. He studied computer science. Now Alexei works for a technology company based in Yakutsk. He's bilingual, speaking Russian fluently, and Sakha with less fluency because he didn't speak it as a child. He's thinking about moving to Moscow because there are better opportunities in technology. But he's hesitant because his family is in Yakutia. Alexei represents a kind of generational shift. He's not quite Russian and not quite Sakha in the traditional sense. He's Russian-speaking and educated in the Soviet system, but from an indigenous Sakha family. He's dealing with the tension between modernization and cultural identity. There's a woman named Natasha who is a scientist. She's from St. Petersburg originally, but has been working in Yakutsk for 10 years, studying permafrost. She came to Yakutsk for a research position and has extended her stay repeatedly because the research is so important and so interesting. Natasha doesn't speak Sakha. She speaks Russian and English. She's an outsider in many ways, but she's become invested in the place. She's seen the permafrost thaw faster than the models predicted. She's helped write papers about the implications. She's frustrated by the slow response to climate change, but also impressed by the resilience of the people who live there. There's a young man named Konstantin who works as a guide for tourists wanting to experience extreme cold. He was born in Yakutsk and has lived there his whole life. He's genuinely enthusiastic about the place and about sharing the experience with people from warmer places. Konstantin makes decent money guiding tourists. He's found a niche doing something that he genuinely enjoys. He's adapted to the modern economy. He's one of the people who has found a way to make living in Yakutia work in the 21st century. There's an elderly woman named Maria who speaks Sakha as her first language and Russian as a second language. She's over 80 years old and has lived in Yakutia her whole life. She remembers the pre-Soviet period, if dimly. She lived through the Soviet era and the collectivization period that her family suffered through. Maria represents a living link to the past. She's a keeper of Sakha language and traditions. She's been interviewed by linguists interested in preserving the Sakha language. She tells stories about what life was like in Yakutia before all the modern development. She's a cultural resource, but she's also just a person who's lived a long life in a difficult place. There's a teenager named Sasha who was born in Yakutsk and has lived there his whole life. He speaks Russian primarily and learns Sakha in school as a second language. He's interested in getting out of Yakutsk and moving to Moscow to attend university and pursue opportunities that he feels aren't available in Yakutia. Sasha is typical of many young people. He feels trapped by the location and the climate. He sees the limited economic opportunities. He's drawn to Moscow and the idea of a more dynamic, warmer place. Whether he'll stay away or eventually come back is unclear. There's an older man named Pavel who works in the diamond mines. He's been working there for 30 years. He's making good money, but also knowing that the mining industry is not sustainable forever. He's worried about what will happen when he retires or when the mines close. Pavel represents the economic tension in Yakutia. He's benefiting from resource extraction now, but knows it's probably not sustainable long term. He's got a family that depends on his income. He's invested in his current situation, but also aware that change might be forced upon him. Traditional Sakha practices and modern continuities. Let me talk about some traditional Sakha practices that are still maintained to some degree because they're culturally important and also give insight into how the Sakha have survived in Yakutia for centuries. The Ihiak festival that I mentioned earlier is worth going into more depth about. It's a celebration of Sakha culture and summer solstice. The name comes from the word for life or living in Sakha. The festival includes traditional games, music, dance, and cultural performances. Ihiak has ancient roots in Sakha culture. It was traditionally a festival where families would gather after the long winter to celebrate the return of warmth and light. It was a time for socializing, for young people to meet, for honoring the spirits and the natural world. The Soviet Union suppressed Ihiak, seeing it as backward and superstitious. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, the festival was revived. Now it's a major annual event in Yakutia, celebrated in Yakutsk and in smaller towns throughout the region. The modern Ihiak festival is kind of a blend of traditional practices and modern spectacle. There are traditional games like horse racing and traditional wrestling. There's traditional music and dance, but there's also modern stage production and tourism marketing. It's been kind of professionalized and turned into a cultural and tourist event. But underneath the modern trappings, there's genuine cultural expression. People who participate are engaging with Sakha traditions and Sakha identity. It's a real cultural event, even if it's been shaped by modern tourism and commercialization. There's also the traditional Sakha cuisine. The most famous Sakha food is probably kumis, which is fermented horse milk. It's been made the same way for centuries. You milk the horses, ferment the milk in a wooden container, and you get a slightly alcoholic beverage that was traditionally consumed during the summer months. Making kumis is kind of a science. You need to maintain the right temperature, let it ferment the right amount of time, keep it in the right kind of container. Traditionally, kumis was a way to preserve the nutritional value of milk during the season when horses produced a lot of milk. Modern kumis is still made using similar traditional methods, though some producers have added modern sanitation practices. You can buy kumis in markets in Yakutsk. It's considered a traditional Sakha food and a marker of cultural identity. There's also traditional Sakha meat preparation. Reindeer and horse meat are prepared in specific ways that have been developed over centuries. Dried meat, called yamai, is prepared by hanging meat in the cold wind to dry. It lasts for a long time and was traditionally used to store meat through the winter. Traditional hunting practices are less common now, but are still maintained by some people, particularly older hunters. They use techniques and knowledge that have been passed down for generations. They know where to find moose in winter, how how to hunt them using skis and traditional weapons, how to process the meat efficiently. These traditional practices are not just ways of getting food or making beverages. They're expressions of Sakha cultural identity. They're ways of maintaining connection to the past and to the land. They're ways of demonstrating that Sakha culture is alive and ongoing. There's also traditional Sakha clothing. The traditional dress includes specific styles of coats, boots, hats, and accessories that have been designed over centuries to be both beautiful and functional in extreme cold. The clothing is often decorated with traditional patterns and embroidery. Modern Sakha people don't wear traditional clothing in everyday life. They wear modern winter clothing that's practical for extreme cold, but doesn't have the cultural distinctiveness of traditional dress. But traditional clothing is worn for festivals and cultural events. It's maintained and preserved as part of cultural heritage. There's also traditional Sakha music and musical instruments. The national instrument of the Sakha is the komis, which is a small jaw harp made from wood or metal. It creates a distinctive sound by using the mouth and tongue to modulate the vibrations. The komis is traditionally played at social gatherings and celebrations. It's a portable instrument that was often played by herders while tending animals. Modern Sakha musicians still play the komis, sometimes in traditional ways and sometimes in contemporary musical contexts. There's also Sakha throat singing, though this is more associated with the Tuvan people to the south. But there are some Sakha throat singing traditions that have been maintained. Traditional Sakha dance is also still practiced and performed. The movements and steps of traditional dances are specific and have been maintained over generations. They're performed at festivals and cultural events. They tell stories and express emotions in movement. All of these traditional practices are part of what keeps Sakha culture alive. They're ways of connecting to the past. They're ways of expressing identity. They're ways of resisting complete assimilation into Russian culture. But they're also under pressure. Each generation of younger Sakha people knows less about these traditions than the previous generation. The economic pressures and the pull of modern urban life push people away from maintaining these practices. The question is whether enough people will continue to maintain these traditions for them to survive into the future. The indigenous rights movement and political activism, okay. Let's talk about the political and human rights aspects of this, because that's also a significant part of the modern story of Yakutia. The Sakha people and other indigenous peoples of Siberia have been organizing to assert their rights and to have a say in decisions that affect their land and their future. This is part of a broader indigenous rights movement that's happening globally. The issues that indigenous peoples in Yakutia are organizing around include land rights, resource rights, cultural rights, and environmental protection. There's tension between indigenous peoples who want control over their own lands and the Russian government and resource extraction companies that want to continue exploiting natural resources. One of the significant moments in this movement was the organization of indigenous peoples, conferences, and forums, where Sakha and other indigenous peoples could coordinate and advocate for their rights. This became more possible after the Soviet Union collapsed, when political organizing became less suppressed. There's also the question of Sakha nationalism. Some Sakha intellectuals and activists have advocated for greater autonomy or even independence for the Sakha Republic. This is politically sensitive because the Russian government doesn't want any of its regions to become independent. The Sakha Republic, as an autonomous republic within the Russian Federation, has some degree of self-governance. It has its own elected government and legislature, but ultimate authority rests with the Russian federal government. The Sakha Republic government can pass laws and make policies, but these are subject to the Russian Constitution and federal law. This creates tension because the Sakha Republic government might want to pursue policies that the federal government doesn't support. For example, environmental protection might be a priority for local government, but resource extraction might be a priority for the federal government and resource companies. There are also tensions within Sakha society. Some Sakha people are invested in resource extraction and economic development. Some are more focused on environmental protection and cultural preservation. These different groups have different priorities and different visions for the future. There's also the question of who gets to speak for the Sakha people. The Sakha Republic government claims to represent Sakha interests, but there are also grassroots organizations and activists who feel that the government is too compromised by its relationship with Russian federal authorities. Indigenous rights movements in Siberia are also connected to global indigenous rights movements. Sakha activists and leaders participate in international forums on indigenous rights. They learn from and share experiences with indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. One of the practical aspects of this movement is the documentation of Sakha language and culture. There are language preservation projects. There are oral history projects where elders are interviewed about their lives and their knowledge. There are cultural organizations working to maintain traditional practices. There's also advocacy around environmental issues specific to indigenous peoples. Climate change, permafrost thawing, and resource extraction all disproportionately affect indigenous peoples who depend on the land for traditional practices. Indigenous organizations have been advocating for attention to these issues. There's a specific issue around reindeer herding, which is still practiced by some Sakha people and by other peoples like the Evenki. Climate change is affecting the food sources for reindeer. Mining operations are disrupting migration routes. The populations of wild reindeer are declining. Herders are struggling to maintain their traditional practices. Indigenous organizations have been advocating for protection of reindeer herds and for allowing herders to have a say in land management decisions that affect their animals. The internet and modern connectivity, one thing that's dramatically changed Yakutia in recent years, is internet access. For a long time, Yakutia was extremely isolated. Physical distance from other population centers meant that information and connection to the outside world was limited. Now, almost everyone in Yakutsk has internet access. There are internet cafes, there are smartphones, there are online services. Yakutia is connected to the global internet. This has enormous implications. Young people in Yakutsk can watch YouTube videos about what's happening anywhere in the world. They can take online classes from universities elsewhere. They can participate in global communities around their interests. It's also created new forms of cultural expression. Sakha youth are creating content in Russian and Sakha and English. There are Sakha YouTubers and TikTokers. There's Sakha content on streaming services. Internet connectivity has also made it easier for people to leave Yakutia. You can work remotely and live in Yakutsk. You can attend university online. You can participate in global markets. This has created some new opportunities, though it's also intensified the pull of leaving for warmer places. The internet has also created new platforms for activism. Indigenous rights activists can organize using social media. Environmental activists can share information about climate change and environmental destruction. Artists can reach global audiences with their work. But internet connectivity has also brought new forms of cultural homogenization. Global culture, often mediated through English language platforms and Western corporations, is spreading. Young people are exposed to global consumer culture. There's pressure to adopt global fashion, music, and values. This creates tension with efforts to preserve local Sakha culture. As global culture becomes more available and more attractive to young people, maintaining Sakha language and traditions becomes more difficult. Environmental research and scientific interest. Yakutia has become a major focus of scientific research, particularly related to permafrost, climate change, and extreme environments. Scientists from all over the world are interested in studying Yakutia because it's a place where climate change is happening rapidly and visibly. The thawing permafrost is releasing carbon that has been locked away for thousands of years. The landscape is changing year to year. The environmental effects are visible and measurable. There are research stations in Yakutia where scientists study permafrost. There's the Sakha State University, which has programs in permafrost science and Arctic studies. There are international collaborations between Russian scientists and scientists from other countries. This scientific interest has brought some economic benefits to Yakutia. Scientists need guides, translators, and support staff. Research equipment is purchased locally. Hotels and restaurants serve researchers. But it's also created some tensions. There's indigenous environmental knowledge held by local people that's been developed over centuries. But this knowledge is sometimes not fully respected or integrated into scientific research. Researchers might focus on quantitative data and measurements, while overlooking the qualitative knowledge held by local indigenous people. There's also the question of who benefits from the research. The knowledge generated by studying Yakutia might benefit scientists and institutions in wealthy countries, people living in Yakutia might not see direct benefits. That said, there are collaborative research projects where local people are engaged as co-researchers and knowledge holders. There are programs training young Sakha people as researchers. There's increasing recognition that scientific and indigenous knowledge should be integrated. Cultural tourism and its implications, as I mentioned. Yakutia has been developed as a tourist destination, particularly focused on extreme cold experiences and indigenous culture. Tour companies advertise experiences like standing outside in -40-degree weather, testing your cold resistance. There are trips to see permafrost landscapes. There are visits to reindeer herds. There are experiences with Sakha culture. This tourism brings money into Yakutia. It provides jobs for guides and hospitality workers. It creates economic opportunities. For some people, tourism is the future economic foundation of the region. But tourism also brings challenges. There's environmental impact from tourist activities. There's potential for cultural appropriation, where Sakha culture is packaged and sold for consumption by outsiders in ways that might distort or oversimplify it. There's the question of whether tourism actually benefits local people, or whether most of the money goes to outside tour operators. There's also the question of whether outsiders visiting to experience extreme cold and indigenous culture actually develop genuine understanding, or whether they're just collecting experiences. But tourism also creates space for cultural expression and cultural pride. If Yakutia is being marketed based on Sakha culture and extreme environment, then maintaining that culture becomes economically valuable. Guides might teach tourists about Sakha traditions. Museums might display Sakha art and artifacts. So tourism is complicated. It brings money, but also exploitation. It creates pressure on culture, but also creates space for cultural expression. The question of sustainability, the fundamental question facing Yakutia, is whether the current situation is sustainable. Can you keep extracting resources and pursuing economic development while also dealing with climate change and trying to preserve culture? From an environmental perspective, the answer is probably no. Climate change is happening faster than expected. Resource extraction is damaging the environment. The permafrost that the infrastructure is built on is thawing. If current trends continue, Yakutia faces environmental catastrophe. From an economic perspective, the situation is also fragile. The economy is dependent on resource extraction, but resource extraction is not sustainable forever. Eventually, you run out of resources. The diamonds will run out. The oil and gas won't last forever. From a cultural perspective, there's the slow erosion of Sakha language and traditions as younger people become more Russian and less Sakha. Unless there's a deliberate effort to maintain and revive these traditions, they might disappear within a generation or two. So the question is, what would a sustainable future for Yakutia look like? One possibility is a transition to renewable energy and other sustainable industries. Tourism could be developed responsibly. Education and technology could be expanded. Some resource extraction could continue, but at a smaller scale with stricter environmental protections. From a cultural perspective, deliberate efforts to preserve Sakha language and traditions would be necessary. More resources for education in Sakha, more support for cultural institutions, more respect for indigenous rights and knowledge. From a political perspective, indigenous peoples would need to have more power and autonomy to determine the future of their region. Decisions about resource extraction and development would need to involve local people and indigenous authorities, not just be imposed from Moscow. None of this is guaranteed to happen, but it's what a sustainable future would probably require. The dreams and realities of the future let me end this long, winding journey through Yakutian history and culture by talking about the dreams and realities of people who live there and think about the future. Some young people dream of leaving, want to go to Moscow or other warmer cities where there are more opportunities and warmer weather. They see Yakutia as a place to leave behind. They dream of normal winters and more diverse economies. Some people dream of reviving traditional practices. They want to see reindeer herding revived. They want more people speaking Sakha. They want Sakha culture to be central to Yakutian identity. Some people dream of developing Yakutia as a major center of climate research and environmental science. They see Yakutia as becoming a globally important place for understanding climate change and developing solutions. Some people dream of independence or greater autonomy for Yakutia. They want to see the Sakha Republic govern itself without Moscow control. They want to see indigenous peoples have power over their own future. Some people just dream of stability. They want a job that provides income. They want their children to be able to stay if they want to. They want the infrastructure to keep working. They want life to be manageable. The reality is that these dreams are in tension with each other and with the constraints of the actual situation. You can't revive traditional reindeer herding while also pursuing industrial resource extraction. You can't maintain permafrost-dependent infrastructure while climate change is thawing the permafrost. You can't ignore the pull of warmer, more economically dynamic places while wanting young people to stay. But humans are good at living with contradictions. People can be pulling in different directions and still build a life together. The question is whether that life is improving or declining, whether there's hope or despair. Right now, Yakutia is at a kind of crossroads. The resources that have powered the economy are not infinite. The climate is changing in ways that will reshape the region. The young people are leaving. The culture is under pressure. But there's also resilience. The Sakha people have adapted to living in an extreme environment for centuries. They've survived colonialism, Soviet rule, and the collapse of an empire. They're adapting to climate change and to the modern world. There's also progress. The Sakha language is being preserved and taught. Sakha culture is being celebrated and valued. Indigenous peoples are organizing and advocating for their rights. New industries are developing. New technologies are being adapted to the extreme environment. The future of Yakutia is uncertain. It could go in many different directions. It could become an environmental catastrophe. It could become a center of climate research and sustainable development. It could maintain its resource extraction economy at diminishing levels. It could be depopulated as people leave for warmer places. It could see indigenous peoples gain more control and power. It could see indigenous culture revived. Probably, it will be some combination of these things. There will be progress and setbacks. There will be people leaving and people staying. There will be environmental challenges and human adaptations. There will be cultural loss and cultural preservation. For the people living in Yakutia, the future is something they'll have to navigate day by day, winter by winter, with the tools they have and the knowledge they've inherited from centuries of living in the coldest place on Earth. Conclusion: the remarkable human story. Okay, so after all of this, after all the history and the culture and the environmental challenges and the individual stories, what's the takeaway? I think it's that humans are remarkable. The Sakha people, the Russians who moved to Siberia, the scientists who study the region, the young people trying to figure out their futures, the elders maintaining traditions, all of these people are remarkable in their own ways. Living in Yakutia should be impossible. The cold is extreme. The darkness is intense. The isolation is complete. The challenges are genuine and constant. And yet, thousands of years of humans have lived there. They've built cultures. They've created art and music and traditions. They've survived colonialism and war and social upheaval. They've adapted to technological change and economic upheaval. The story of Yakutia is not a story of triumph or progress in the linear sense. It's a story of adaptation and persistence. It's a story of a people and a landscape that have shaped each other over centuries. It's a story of cultural creativity and resilience in the face of extreme conditions and external pressure. It's also a story about the future, because Yakutia is not frozen in time. It's a living, changing place. The people who live there are dealing with problems that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Climate change, permafrost thawing, global capitalism and resource extraction, internet connectivity, and the pull of global culture. These are new challenges, but they're challenges that humans have faced before in different forms: change and adaptation and cultural transformation. The Sakha people have dealt with these kinds of challenges before. They'll figure out how to deal with them now. That doesn't mean everything will work out fine. There will be losses. There will be pain. People will suffer. Cultures will change and transform in ways that are both loss and creation. But there's also hope, because humans are capable of remarkable things. We're capable of adapting to extreme environments. We're capable of creating meaning and beauty in harsh places. We're capable of standing up for what we believe in. We're capable of learning from the past and imagining different futures. The story of Yakutia is a human story. It's a story about what it means to be human in a place that should be uninhabitable. It's a story about culture and identity and survival. It's a story about cold and darkness and permafrost and resilience. And as you drift off to sleep, think about the Sakha herders bringing their horses in from the winter pasture. Think about the children in Yakutsk playing outside in -40-degree weather. Think about the scientists studying the thawing permafrost. Think about the young people deciding whether to stay or leave. Think about the elders telling stories in Sakha to children who are learning English on their smartphones. Think about how humans have managed to build lives and cultures and meaning in one of the harshest places on Earth. Think about how remarkable that is. And then, as you settle into your warm bed, be grateful that you're not living in Yakutia, but also respect the people who are, because they're doing something remarkable. That's the story of Yakutia. That's the story of how humans have learned to live in the coldest place on Earth. Thanks for staying with me through this long journey. I hope you sleep well.